Deep Yogi, welcome to 10% True. It's good to see you both.
Good to see
Thank
you
you.
too,
Same
Steve.
here.
So, astute viewers will recognize the man at the bottom of my screen. I don't know where he's going to appear in the recording, but Yogi, it's good to see you again. Thanks for rejoining us on the channel.
Yeah, it's
Um,
nice to be here, and I enjoyed the last time we did it too.
Last time we had Necklace Rudd, we had Reno Pelletier, and we had Smythe joining us. Today we've got Steve Turner. We're going to talk Strike Eagle. We're going to talk specifically around the lead up to the Strike Eagle going to Desert Storm Desert Shield in August of 1990, and then Desert Storm in January of 1991. There may be some familiar territory that we're going to cover in terms of doing that this time round, and some of the things that we talked about last time round when we had the four on the channel. But that's not an issue for me, and I hope the audience understands that. But it might be helpful for the audience. I'll put a link in the description. If they want to go and check out that previous interview, then they can do. With that caveat in place, let's get started. Yogi, do you want to quickly reintroduce yourself to the audience or introduce yourself to new
Sure,
members of the audience?
sure. I went through pilot training at Euro NATO Joint Jet pilot training at Shepherd Air Force Base. Flew the F4 for about 8 years. Flew the F4 C, D, E, and G. Went through weapons school in the F4, and then was in the first group of guys that flew the Strike Eagle. From Seymour Johnson to Luke, back to Seymour Johnson, was the first weapons officer in the 336 Fighter Squadron. We got back from Luke, and just a few months after we got back, we were in the room prepping to head to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Yogi. Steve, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Steve Turner was in the Air Force for 27 years. Started out as in training command, and in 1977 had the opportunity to go to the F4. From there, I ended up over that period of time, I did 3 tours at Seymour Johnson. So a total of 11 years at Seymour Johnson. Got to fly in all the 3 fighter squadrons, 34th, 35th, and 36. And it was a wonderful wing. Sort of, we always talked about it as being a blue collar wing, but all 3 wings were exceptional and a delight to be with. So I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about Seymour and TAC and Desert Storm.
Before we hit record, I'd said, well, where do you guys want to start? And Steve, you'd said maybe 1977 and Red Flag. Do you want to pick up what
I
you're
do.
talking about?
So one of the things that I'd like to sort of set the stage with was where we were as far as readiness. I go back to 1977, and I just joined the 334th Eagle Squadron, and ended up going to Red Flag. And every night I would go home and I would call my wife, because I thought that might be the last time, might be the last day that I was going to be alive, because it was wild. From that point, General Creech, who was well-known and very famous and legendary in Tactical Air Command, basically at that point got put in place a pretty stringent training program. We had to do, just to get down to, the 100 feet, or actually just to 300 feet, there was a check, it was a program. You had to fly so many sorties, and then to go below that, it was even harder. They kept track of your bombing records and how you were doing and all that sort of thing. So that by the time you got out there, you were better trained. Now, let's step forward from that point on. By the time we were getting ready to go to Desert Storm, the training that we were doing in the squadron, I felt, was probably just as challenging as what we were seeing in Red Flag. I mean, Red Flag was, sort of a piece of cake. We didn't have to do any step down programs, any training programs like that. And so even though the airplane was new to us, and like as I was talking to you earlier, because we didn't have the targeting pod, particularly for the 336 guys, we basically flew the airplane like a big F4. So I mean, the front seater listen to the backseat. The backseater ran the radar, and we probably didn't take advantage of a lot of the things, a lot of the equipment that we had. That we would, that later on, once we got the targeting pod, the airplane, what the capabilities of the airplane was remarkable, and we're still finding it to this day.
Yeah, and if I jump forward probably another 5 years when the weapons school started, we made those changes, wholesale changes to the way we employed the airplane. Had front seaters running the radar, going to the merge with the radar in the front cockpit, but because we knew the back seaters were going to be busy. We don't go do just pure air to air. So we're fighting our way into a battle to get through that battle to get bombs on target. And so we need both people in the airplane keeping the airplane alive, and that backseater still concentrating on getting updates and all the stuff he needs to put a bomb on target once we get past whatever adversary might be out there. So we had a C model guy in our division, and this is something, Steve, you and I have talked about doing another one of these videos with Mike Bumpus potentially to talk about the weapons school and how it all started. And that also, I'll save a bunch of that for that. But just to piggyback on what Steve was just talking about, we wholesale changed the way we employed this airplane once we fired up the weapons school and figured out what the best way to employ it was.
Yeah. And we knew afterwards, or when we came back and had a chance to sit down and talk about what had going on, that my thought was that we probably, when we were doing the transition, we probably should have included a F-16 guy or an F-15C model guy. And in fact, after I left Seymour, I ended up being the DO or Ops Group Commander at Lakenheath, and I had the opportunity. We had 2 F-15E squadrons, but we also had a C model squadron, and essentially, I had the opportunity to pretty much go out and cherry pick over USAFE, because at that point it was a big drawdown, and basically the cherry pick the pilots. And it turned out it was almost like an F-15C weapons school squadron, because the briefings and debriefings were, they would take for, they were long and they were in depth, and they beat and as usual, we beat the heck out of one another. But the thing that impressed me flying in these I was flying in the back seat, was just how good these guys were running the radar. Far better than we were. I think back to listening to the podcast that you had before, particularly we were talking about the first night of the war, which probably was the most challenging, because that means we were actually at low altitude and so forth, and we had MiGs running on us. We were a chocolate mess as far as finding the guys and being able to shoot them and so forth, and so we've come a long way, and it's really, and that part is really good to see.
Yeah, I have no doubt on that first night that had we had the training that the weapons school generated, had Desert Storm happened 5 years later, I have no doubt we'd had the first 2 kills in the war out of the Strike Eagles.
Yeah, I agree with you. The other thing too was that when you look at, for example, the 80-some pilots and backseaters that we had that were between the 2 fighter squadrons, that when we finally started the war, the first night of the war, only three of the 3 pilots had been in combat. So we're almost at a point where we had lost, how to do it, what to expect, like how was a senior guy like me, to be able to, to have, to help build the confidence levels and so forth of the folks that are not, that were younger, because, I was just as clueless as they were, and I think it was a dying art. I hate to say that we have to have an art for, going to war, but quite frankly, I think you do. And I think that the group of pilots and backseaters that we've got now throughout the whole Air Force, they've had that opportunity, and I think it's worth, and it's needed. It also helps you to recognize when when you come across something that just doesn't sound right, like some mission that's sort of crazy, which we'll talk about a little bit about here later. You can wave the
I lost you then, Steve.
Did we lose some audio?
Yeah,
So going from that, you'd have gotten a kick out of when we got the orders that we were going to go to.
Can you hear us?
I got you now.
Yeah. Okay. I think we just had a somewhere along the line there was a break.
Okay.
Okay. So pick up from what you were going to say about getting a kick, Steve.
Oh yeah, I think you'll get a kick out about when we ended up deploying. Interestingly, we had just come off of an exercise, and we had a guy named Dave Wells who was in charge of putting together the exercises, and he actually put together the scenario, the exact scenario that we were seeing. And so, as you're probably aware, in these exercises, they last 3 or 4 days, and so that they've got a definite endpoint. Anyway, that was finished, and we were actually at had a beer call, and the word came out that sounds like something's going down in the Middle East, and we might be next. And then of course we got noticed and notified that we were going to go, and you would not believe how much stuff we packed. I mean, if we could go back today and take a look at the numbers of safes and stuff and papers and whatever, I mean, we could have gotten rid of 3/4 of it. Because I can't imagine. I can't tell you how many 141s. When you take a look at all the air, the tactical command that was going. I mean, my gosh, we overfilled more than we should have. So it was crazy.
Yeah.
Let me take you back then, if I may, and just ask a couple of questions about some of the things that you've just discussed. So the first question I wanted to ask then is around the 23 Class A mishaps at Red Flag in 1977. Why? Why was it that dangerous?
We weren't, well, we didn't train, we weren't training to that level at home. And particularly, we weren't training to 300 feet. It was, typically we're flying 500 feet. We weren't going down to 300 feet, and surely we weren't going down to 100 feet. And I think that was probably that's an art to be able to do that and to do it well. You take a look at the Brits when they fly. Probably the Brits were the best at doing the 100 feet, because they had planned their whole Air Force around a low altitude delivery. And particularly with their Tornadoes, but even before that, the Jaguars and so forth. And we did not do that as much. Didn't have as many the opportunities to drop live. So that was some of that. So I'd have
to. You remember what kind of flying time you were getting back in those days too? Because the Air Force has gone on cycles where you fly 12 sorties a month, 15 sorties a month. And then all of a sudden there's cutbacks and stuff, and you're flying 6 or 7 times a month.
Yeah, no, I can't really put a finger. I can't put a finger on that, but regardless, I mean, it was it was shocking.
So the other question I'd ask then around what you discussed then, and it's a bit of a long-winded question, and maybe you'll touch on it later, in which case we can move on, but just around this idea. So when you went to Lakenheath, I guess that was the mid-90s then. So 92, I think the Strike Eagles arrived at Lakenheath.
Yeah, correct.
So that was after the war. Yogi, I think when we talked last time, I think it was you said to me, you were in the bar at Seymour and the general came in and said, you're not going to do any air-to-air in the F-15E. You're only going to drop bombs with it. And you had used that expression as well about it being a glorified F-4E or whatever. So I wondered then, sort of culturally, at a captain and at a major level then, what is happening that is preventing you from not doing more with the F-15E more quickly? Is it the generals telling you can't? Is it because you're in a mindset where this is how you do things, so this is how you carry on doing things? Is it natural that actually it takes a couple of years for you to figure out how to take advantage of new technologies and capabilities?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points in here worth talking about. Number one, I think one of the biggest issues was a $60 million airplane, which was the most expensive thing we'd put out at that point in time. And of course, all the general officers were like, we can't lose these airplanes in peacetime. And so I think that was a piece of it. The other part of it too, and I don't know if we really touched this in the first video, but For the average guy coming into a Strike Eagle, it's almost 200 hours before your hands do what they're supposed to do just naturally. I mean, before that, for that whole first 200 hours, you have to think, I need to move my left index finger to do this. And sometimes by the time you've done that, your opportunity to do whatever you're trying to do is passed because you're cruising around at 600 miles an hour. So I think a piece of it was some of that. We needed to get all the HOTAS, hands on throttles and stick stuff down to be able to employ the airplane correctly. And I know that's a piece of why the radar ended up in the back seat for the first couple of years we flew the airplane, because that guy could take the time to do what he needed to do. And I didn't have to think about, okay, that's my middle finger and my left hand, while I'm still moving the throttles and the stick and doing all the other stuff that you got to do from the front seat. And so I think there's a couple.
The other part of it was that just the way the training was set up, we were an air to ground. I mean, basically an air to ground squadron. Okay, so the predominantly our training was going to, and the training emphasis was going to be on air to ground. Dropping bombs, and we, one of the, one of the pieces that we continually, lamented about was the fact that. We had all this air-to-air capability, but we never really, we didn't have the opportunity to go out and train at a level that we needed to, or that the airplane would allow us to do.
Well, if you remember right too, that what we were finding out as we were dropping bombs off the Strike Eagle, the airflow underneath the belly of the airplane was something nobody had ever seen before. You might drop a 25-pound practice bomb and have it hang up underneath the airplane, just floating with you for 400 or 500 feet before it got out of the jet stream and could get away from the airplane. And so we're going to Dare County range, dropping bombs and thinking you're going to put bombs within 25 meters or whatever. And all of a sudden you throw a bomb out there and it's 400 long of the target. And you're going, what just happened?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of new stuff going on with the airplane that it was completely unlike an F4. And how an F4 delivered weapons.
Would bringing a C model guy into the environment then have really made a difference? Would you have got to 1992 and then it would have been parity between the Strike Eagle Squadron and the Grim Reapers at Lakenheath flying their C models in terms of the air-to-air game?
I don't know if it would have been that. I don't know if it would have been that quick, but I do think that whoever we brought in. One, you just couldn't bring in a lieutenant. You needed to bring in somebody. You need to bring in a weapons school grad. That would be able to not only that had credibility, that had the opportunity to fly with the guys, and you had to have the senior leadership had to know, hey, this individual is a special guy, and we're going to give him access to it. Yogi and I have seen, over the years, there's been a sine curve. A lot of commanders have been afraid of weapons school grads. They're always afraid that we're going to kill them. And, fortunately at Seymour, it wasn't that way. And in fact, when we went to Desert Storm, all three squadron commanders were weapons school grads. And also at that time, our senior leadership, the general officers were even weapons school grads. So that was a big help. But there were periods where, they sort of wanted you to shut up and color and stay out of the way because they were afraid that you were going to put their squadron in harm's way.
And again, if I step forward to the weapons school, we had an F-15C guy as one of the initial 8 cadre instructors at the weapons school. And that's another reason that we shifted so far in the tactics of the airplane. But even when I went back as the squadron commander of the weapons school, John Boy Varwig was the F-15C commander, and we put rides together, had 6 C models and 2 E models in an 8 ship going 8V26 or 8V32. And so phenomenal learning for our guys, as well as the C model guys, because they got firsthand knowledge of what the targeting pod could do in a large environment with many, many adversaries. Instead of just guessing that you've got 10 guys in a north package, we can sit out there with the target pod and tell you, no, there's 12 in that one. There's 6 in the middle and 8 in the south.
Yeah.
And so it was very beneficial for us. And one of the things I stipulated as a commander of the Strike Eagle guys was I don't want my guys leading something like that. We'll never be in a place where we will lead something like that. But I'd love to have my guys experience an 8VX and get that under their belt to go back and go, okay, I've been in one of these. I know what it feels like.
Yeah. If we jump forward to Al Karj, or actually the Thumrait, because it was a little bit of heaven. We were outside of General Order Number 1, so we had a beer locker, and so things didn't change, and we didn't have the DTs right off the bat. Basically, Oman became a tactics range and a tactics development range, and when you consider. As a good example, the first night that we went in, there was a lot of us. I think Yogi and his group went in at low altitude, which was something that we were used to, pretty much dropping straight and level. But I took my group against H2 airfield, and we basically did a fly-up maneuver, and rolled in, and that was something that we never did. So we got to practice, all the steps that had to be made to make sure that you had properly targeted, and then were able to roll in. And at the same time, I will just tell you, even though we did that on every ride, it's still, just like Yogi said, it wasn't automatic, as well as, some of the things that we found, the first night that we went in, as fast as we could go was 520. Because, and the point being is we couldn't go any faster than 520 knots, was because just to keep the formation together. And what we didn't consider was, and we also didn't want to use a burner because you were going to give yourself away. You would highlight yourself. But when you started that climb up to 15,000 feet, the poor guy that was in mine, it was Steve Quast, Killer Quast. And he was whining like a big dog because, he was about to fall out of the sky because he, was about to run out of airspeed. That was, and then, we also, some of the things that we did, at the time, and when we first got there, everything was looking for low altitude, was how do you fly at night and stay in formation, and particularly if you have to make a sand break. And I will just tell you, we scared ourselves a number of times. We're lucky as heck that we didn't have a midair, but because we were able to figure out parameters, where to stay, where to keep the ship in front of you, where to keep him on the HUD. And at the end, we were able to make, 6 and 9G turns, and stay in formation, which I thought was pretty, and at low altitude. And we had confidence, so in case that we did get shot at, which, fortunately we never had to use. And then the other part too was that, we talk about the targeting pod wasn't there. Well, the EW kit we had wasn't mechanized. It was mechanized for the later model Soviet missiles. So we had nothing against an SA-2 and an SA-3. And it was then that we realized, particularly at medium altitude, that if we could maintain 0.9 Mach, do a 2G weave, didn't even have to put chaff out, we could defeat an SA-2. And in fact, Yogi and I and a wingman did that one night coming back from a mission we'll talk about. We used to joke that when you started doing this, everybody would whistle, and when somebody quit whistling, you knew they got shot. So
yeah, I will say that fly up for you was extremely well planned.
Can you describe that?
You planned it.
And the formation stuff we did, Pete Hook and I worked out a lot of that stuff in West Virginia when we first got back with the airplane. We got together and decided we got to figure out some way to put these airplanes into a target area faster than we can from a 7 or 8 mile trail. And so he and I took some missions and went out in West Virginia low levels and practiced all this stuff that we kind of picked up some techniques from the F-111s. but turned it into something that we could use using all the systems on our jet to make it work.
Can you describe it? What is the fly up tactic then, or whatever it's called?
Well, we all ran in at low altitude on the first night, and Steve's sixth ship was the only one that actually came out of low altitude structure. All the rest of us came up from 100 feet to 500 feet to drop rock eye and other weapons. And we didn't fly the whole thing at 100 feet. We had 100 feet set on the TFR and basically flew 200 to 300 feet just above the box. But the box was set in case you started getting shot at. You could go down, you'd have 100-foot coverage on the terrain following radar. So for his fly up, you figure out a range, what perimeter do you want to dive at up these bombs? You pick 20 degrees, if I remember right, for you guys.
Yeah.
And so you back that up and go, okay, I've got to have this much room to turn the airplane over the top to get the nose pointed down. Back that up, and go, I don't want to light the blowers to do this, so I want to start at whatever it is, 15, 17, 18 miles to start this 20 to 25 degree nose high climb and no power to get up to 15,000 feet so that you could then roll over the top and be on a 20-degree wire, something that everybody does recognize because that's what we were doing at Dare County Range.
Yeah.
I was at 10, 20, 30-degree wire for dropping bombs. And you roll in and go, okay, where's my target now? All I got to do is line up my Pipper and my ASL and get on the line there so that I drop my bombs where I want them. What happened in this particular case, and it's funny, I was just reading Smallwood's book some last night, and particularly that mission you're talking about. Some of those guys got enamored by, I think Steve will tell you, when he rolled in as number one on that target, you roll in and the rabbits are on the runways. It's just like they're open for business, like it's Raleigh, North Carolina. And so they roll in and the rabbits are up, the runway lights are up, the field's all lit up. There's people moving around, all that kind of stuff. And so I think Seedin was in your flight in your sixth ship, if I remember right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he talks about, he got so enamored by looking out that he looks in and he's at 20,000 feet instead of 15 at 280 knots or something like that when he's supposed to be at 400. And so that's what created some of that issue, is not necessarily maybe not as much that we hadn't done that kind of stuff a great deal, but that the fact that in a first night combat environment, your mind's going to go everywhere. I mean, you're looking out for all kinds of things to happen. They're probably staring at the airfield waiting for something to get shot at them, instead of paying attention to all the details in the inside the cockpit.
And I think that goes back to the inexperience. I mean, not having done it before. You were. I'm going to back you up, Steve, because Yogi, from the very beginning when we got over there, Yogi was a squadron weapons officer. He was dealing with he and his team were putting together the first night flights. And in fact, the whole thing, correct me if I'm wrong, Yogi, but I think the first couple of weeks, or at least first week, was pretty much scripted. I mean, we knew exactly, you could go in, and if nothing changed, these were the targets that we were going to go to. Okay.
Yeah. The first 3 nights in particular, I handed each flight lead a packet with their first 3 nights targets. All the mission planning was done. All the weapons numbers, all that stuff was done. So if nothing changed based on first night activities, they had their package for the second night a couple of weeks before we flew the first night.
Well, and it was like almost weekly, there would be a change. And,
right.
And one of the funny things, and I'll get in trouble over saying this, but because I've already been in trouble with it before, was that every week Yogi would then call back and say, we don't have tankers. There's no tankers set up for, our egress, and everybody's going to be, we're going to be, fairly low on gas at that point. And the answer was always, don't worry, it'll be there. And they weren't, or they weren't where we thought they were going to be. Let's put it that way.
They weren't where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, but even to go back even further was on the first night when they briefed the Israelis that what we were going to do on that first night of the war, the Israelis were upset that we were not going to be hitting SCUDs until 30 minutes after the 117s had gone in and done their thing. So the way that it was supposed to work was obviously the 117s could go in because of the stealth, and then they could come out, and then the next flow was going to be the Weasels and the F-15C model guys to take out any air-to-air threats and any air-to-ground threats, and then that was going to protect us, and so we were going to be coming in 30 minutes later. Well, I mean, shucks, I guess it was less than a week, and we had to redo this whole thing. And so the game plan then was that we said, okay, to appease the Israelis, what they did was they made the TOTs for Baghdad and for H2 and all the things that we were doing were going to be the same. And so the only thing that we had going for us was low altitude. And so the way that it started out, and this is something that we never did or we never trained for, and quite frankly, I'm glad I never had to do it again, was that we basically took off, joined up with the tankers, and there must have been, gosh knows, I don't know, 15 or so tankers in different, all stacked up, some 600 miles from the border. And the point was that so their radar couldn't see that there was a guerrilla coming in, okay? But the deal was, as soon as we hooked up with the tankers, they started a descent down to 5,000 feet. And so if you were in that, and so Yogi and me and a few other guys, we were the lead guys, we hooked up. And so I was in idle and I was standing the speed brakes just to keep from, to stay on the boom, okay? And I'm sure everybody else was doing the same thing. And I remember at one point I looked up, and there were 3 or 4 tankers. They were all because once you start down in a big airplane, it's hard to, since Yogi and I are commercial pilots, we know you can go down and you can slow down, but you can't go down and slow down. And these airplanes were, if I told my backseater, I said, Bones, I said, if one of us were to eject right now, we're going to take out about 3 or 4 airplanes. And so, and fortunately, and I think because, as I was saying, because, we had a good group of pilots, and, we were able to stick on there. But when I got off the boom and where we got off the tanker at 5,000 feet, I told my backseater, Bones Wetzel, I said, Bones, we've got a good chance of surviving. If we just survive that, there's a high probability we're going to survive the rest of the night, because it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy.
Let me take you back then 5 minutes or so, just to the beginning of this particular part of the conversation, where you were, so we were talking about the low level route that Yogi's 6 took, and then the fly up that your 6 took, steep. Why the difference in tactic? Is that driven by threat? Was it because of the familiarity you talked about, because your crews had done it at the Dare Range in North Carolina? Why did you do it differently for H2 than Yogi's flight did?
Well, number one, my guys were carrying Rockeye, which is a cluster munition, 200 little weapons come out, and we were dropping on SCUDs. Steep was dropping Mark 82s, and we had hard targets around H2 airfield that we were trying to hit those harder targets, and needed a heavier weapon to do it. And so that the weapon itself is what drove the difference in tactics.
Yeah.
So for a Rockeye, I set the fuses and the timers and all that stuff appropriately. All I've got to do is climb up to 500 feet, make a level pass across the target. I drop 12 canisters of that stuff, and I'm covering about 12 football fields of space with all those little bomblets to destroy SCUDs. And that's what we were trying to kill that night, was the stationary SCUD sites that we knew were there.
Not exactly knew where they were, but we knew that they were in that proximity. I mean,
these were fixed. Those were fixed sites we're going after on the first night. So, they might be set up on station number 6 with the missile set up ready to shoot at Israel, but at least it's in the general ballpark. Now, some of the other stuff we did later on, we're out in Western Iraq hunting for mobile SCUDs. I'm not very sure we were very successful at that, but we spent a ton of weapons and gas cruising around Western Iraq looking for trucks underneath bridges and trucks set up ready to shoot a missile off at it.
And that was pretty much a political. I mean, I think that was a political targeting. Okay. So
I watched one launch
so
one.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I watched one launch one night. I actually thought it was an SA-2 being shot at us until it went through the horizon and kept on going. And so, we had kind of notched a little bit, but watching this missile going, it seems like it's a long ways out there. And as soon as it went through the horizon, I turned around, lit the blowers, and went racing up there to try to see if we could go find it. And of course, your distance vision at night is suspect on a good day, much less when your heart's beating 1,000 beats a minute. And so we raced up there and looked around for 20 minutes and couldn't find any evidence of where something had been fired.
We actually had later in the war, one of the, so just to set the stage was the way that we had a flow, and the way that typically you'd be scheduled. You'd probably spend a couple of nights, 2 or 3 nights in a row. You'd go out to the western part of Iraq, and you'd be out there hunting for SCUDs. And then you would probably move in for a day or two in the middle part of the country, and you'd go out and then you'd drop. And then the last couple of days before you got a day off, a day off from flying, you were still doing mission planning and stuff like that. You would go into Kuwait, and that basically you'd fly an airplane that just had a centerline bag on it, and go in and do whatever needed to be done in Kuwait, and then you get a night off. Basically, you'd be in charge of the planning group, and then you start the cycle all over again. And so we got it got to be pretty tiring, particularly going out, because those missions out in the western part of the area were, shucks, they were what, 4 or 5 hours, and probably doing 2 or 3 air refuelings. You always had to, before you went into the box, you had to, you would air refuel, and then you'd probably come out and at least do another one in between, and then you, on your way home, you'd come back and hit the tanker and then come home. So that was sort of how the schedule went. As obviously I took over when I first got there, I was the wing weapons officer, I'd known Yogi forever. In fact, I was the assistant ops officer in the 336 when young Mark Alred showed up in the Rocketeers from weapons school, and so we had known one another. And then somewhere along the line, I got sent back over to wing weapons, and so particularly while we were in prior to the startup of the war, we both had opportunities to have meetings with at the general officer level and the general officer staff type level. And Mark and I were talking, a couple of days ago, we were talking, one of the meetings that I went up to, they talked about the attrition and about what the attrition was going to be for the first night. And the attrition for the first night was going to be 29%. Now think about that. 30% we sent out 26 airplanes. Well, it was 26 airplanes in that first go. We only had 24 in the rockets, but that was mind blowing. I remember coming back. I'll just tell you, I came back to my queue and cried. Not that everybody's your closest buddy, but the last thing you want to do is see, have 30% of your force wiped out. And I will also tell you that while it pissed off some of the guys when we were putting together the first night plan, we wanted to save a few folks like Jim Braun. Jim Braun was one of them, I believe, that we and a couple of other guys that were experienced flight leads and so forth, that kept them back because, okay, supposing Yogi and I get shot out of the saddle, we want to make sure that somebody can go on the second go. And, I thought that was very important. The other one was that the other opportunity, Yogi, they were similar, the meetings were similar, but in one, I went up when and I'm trying to put it together, Yogi, if we were there at the same time. I know we didn't go there together, but we ended up in Riyadh.
The one we're talking about the other day, we were both up there at the same time.
I don't know, but I don't remember us traveling together. So,
Oh, I think I went up there a day before on the back of a C-130 or something.
well, I went up in a C-130 as well. And so anyway, in on my story, it just so happens we were walking around the RSAF headquarters there in Riyadh, and all of a sudden I run into Buster Glosson. And just to let you know, Buster and I had a relationship. I mean, Buster and I had been through weapons school back in 1980. And he was going to be the squadron commander, and he was going to be the squadron commander. He was getting checked out, and I was going through weapons school, and he evidently had taken a liking to me. But anyway, we saw each other in the hallway, and he asked me what I was doing. I told him I was at Seymour. I was a wing weapons officer, and he said, "Well, I don't have anybody on my staff that's an F-15E guy, so I'd like for you to come in and be there on the briefing." So we went in, and they gave us the brief, which was, was very impressive. And then at the end, they said, okay, we're going to go downstairs, and Intel is going to provide us with, pictures and charts and so forth. So we go downstairs, and we go out into this open area, and they've got a bunch of big tents, like carnival tents, and they've got tables, and they've got pictures stacked this high. No organization at all. And so we were basically told, just sort through there and find out the targets, the targets that you're going to go against. Like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, I was pretty much dumbfounded. And so that sort of set off the theme about, the intel that we had. And not, you were always wondering, for the longest time, we never got, BDA. So we never knew, and particularly when, the first 3 weeks when we didn't have targeting pods, we didn't know how we were doing. And I remember coming back, after the first week, and, to the wing commander, it was at that point, Colonel Hornberg, and just say, are we winning or losing? We're going back to the same targets. We've lost a couple of airplanes. Two guys were killed, 2 guys are POWs. What's going on? And and even after the war, there was I believe it was a blue ribbon panel or something like that was taking a look at the intel to find out, was it because of administrative processes, or was it because of classification type process, procedures and so forth, why we did not have that information, but at that point, I will tell you, I was happy. I knew General Horner had been the DO when I first got to Seymour back in 1977, and I had been in an incident where I lost a canopy in an air refueling incident, and I had to report in a military manner to Colonel Horner at the time, and he's got a blood vessel right here that pulses when he's pissed off at you, and I saw that in person. I saw that in person. The other thing, at a later time, when the typical process when you become the squadron commander, you have to go. They send you off to the higher headquarters to get to have them take a look at you. So I'd had to fly on the same, probably on a 130, go up, sleep in a Connex, and then go in to brief General Horner. And he's sitting there, he's looking at a booklet that his daughters had put together, and I think it was off color. And he was sitting there, didn't hardly spend any time with me. And so, of course, I was, at the time, the hot topic was flying at 100 feet and also, doing air to air, which 3 times he told me I was a dumb shit. And then he goes, good talking to you, Steve. We'll see you later. I mean, and that's it. Didn't even say, hey, you're the squadron commander. So then I had to fly all the way back to Thumrait, Oman, it took hours on a C-130. Came up to Colonel Hornberg, and I said, have they called you and told you to send somebody else in? He says, no, I guess you're the squadron commander. So, I mean, it was great guys. We were very fortunate. And I think the thing that I remember from, before the war started that really resonated with me was the fact that General Horner said, if you're in a mission and it doesn't look right, don't do it. Okay. I mean, there's not that pressure that you've got, by God, I'm going to go in and, and we're going to make this happen. And that rang true. And the other thing was that, when I took over the group of men that I took over from, I knew them all. I mean, we had grown up together. Like I said, I've had 3 tours at Seymour Johnson. So, I mean, I had been in most of these squadrons, and I knew them, particularly from being the wing weapons officer. And I just stayed out of the way. I mean, Yogi, you and I, we, particularly from a management point, once the war started, the frag came out, the guys got the stuff, and you sort of stayed out of the way unless they had questions for you. I mean, you didn't go, you weren't looking over them all the time and quizzing them and, making sure they were okay. I mean, because you knew that they had their act together.
Yeah, honestly, the most contact I had with guys was when they'd come to me and ask me a weapon didn't come off the way it was supposed to or something, and we'd go back and pull the book out and see what happened, try to figure out what happened. And then there were a couple times that I had to get involved in some conversations on guys that were reporting for next to no reason. And I think I talked about in our first video that we had some guys that aborted unnecessarily. And then other guys, like you remember when Steve Quast led an 11 ship into Iraq with Steve Chilton in the back seat?
Yeah.
His flight lead aborted, and you'd think 2 would go with him and go home. And Steve Quast and Steve Chilton led that 11 ship up to Takadam Airfield right next to Baghdad, just like he was the superstar that he is.
Yeah.
but those were the kind of things that I got involved in on occasion. And I know I talked about it before, but I don't know if Steve even knows about this. When Stansbury's 2-ship went to the tanker, he thought they were going home. They came back into the area out there in Western Iraq one night. And my 4-ship's up in the airspace and owns the airspace. And I look down, I see all these little sprinkly bombs going off in this enormous, great big circle. They were dropping CU-58. And I figured out what it was, and I get on the radio and go, who else is in the airspace up here? Of course, I found out it was Stansbury's number 3 and 4 from the Chiefs. And so I keyed the mic and got on their freak and said, get your ass out of here and go home. Your flight lead's at home. And so they left. And then I came back, and whenever I talked to Stansbury, of course, he was madder than hops because he had told those guys to go to the tanker, get enough gas and go home and let maintenance get the airplanes fixed because they had squawked about something not working correctly. But other than that, I mean, when Dipper shot the AIM-9 at the Fulcrum, I came in and looked at his tape and figured out that it lost the tone as he was hitting the pickle button. No fault of his or anything. It's just the transition of the shot. So I got involved in some of that kind of stuff. But otherwise, I mean, I stayed fairly busy. There were, like I said, I flew 42 missions in 38 nights and took 3 nights off. So there are a number of nights that I'm popping up and down into Iraq a couple times a night. And it was like Steve talked about, the initial wave, everybody's scared because you've never done anything. The next, you get over a few nights, you go, this isn't so bad. Particularly once we moved to medium to high altitude, I got time to defend against an SA2 or an SA3. We're above most of the AAA. That's not so bad. And then you'd take a few nights and you end up in the KTO dropping plinking tanks with LGBs, all night. And that was fairly mundane. And then all of a sudden you'd get tasked to go back to Takadam Airfield next to Baghdad at low altitude. And you just go, oh crap, here we go again. So the emotional ride was just,
yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that wore people out so much that you go, oh, I get to take a break tonight. I'm only going to Kuwait. Mm-hmm. And then you'd walk in, something would change. And now you're flying a full up package against 150 AAA pieces and 15 missile sites and whatever going, oh crap, this could be the night. And that just wipes your brain out.
Hey everybody. Sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together. Tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percenttrue.com. Place an order. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting. The first night we went in at low altitude, and the second night I went to Lille at 35,000 feet, and I came off the autopilot to drop the bombs. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like, you got to be kidding me. Okay, it was crazy stuff. I'm looking at my notes, just because, like I said, Yogi and I talked a little bit about this before, and
Well, while you're looking at that second night, I cruised in at about 35,000 feet, and the sea models were capping east and west, 100 miles inside the border, just waiting for someone to take off. And that's when I went back and told you and Hornberg, we need to take the AIM-7s off these airplanes and put 12 bombs on, because we're wasting 6 stations on 2 missiles that we're never going to have a chance to shoot. And then I don't know if you were ready to get into the Basra.
I was getting ready to get into. We've got about 4 flights, Steve, that were pretty interesting, and I thought we could talk a little bit about that if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the first one I want to talk about, the one with Bull Baker, Yogi,
Yeah.
which I think is interesting. So to set the stage a little bit, once the war got going, the way that we would get a frag, and it would come down, and we'd have a target, and we would have a target that we would have to plan for. But the reality was that the headquarters quickly learned that we had a great capability. We had a great GPS, great INS system, and of course we had the targeting pod. And so typically you would brief, okay, this is where we're going to go, knowing that as soon as you got to the front door, that you were going to get, somebody was going to call and say, hey, oh, by the way, take off and contact AWACS, and AWACS is going to have something for you. And so basically the rule was you take off, you contact AWACS, and then they would probably have another target for you. They might send you over to ABCCC or something along the way as well to get some more definition on what it was going to be. But often they would give you the coordinates for it. They would also sort of give you a word picture of what you were looking at. I chuckled because a lot of times it was going to be a deadly storage site, like everything was always deadly. And then you basically go out, and so the deal was you go out and basically strike that. Now, if you had an issue like weather or something along those lines, at the end of the day, you would come back and you would go against the target that you had briefed. But in this case, the specific mission I'm going to talk a little bit about was that after Dave Everly, who was our DO, got shot, he got shot down on the second day. And they brought in a guy named Bull Baker. Bull Baker was larger than life. He had been shot down in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and he's one of the few people that got out of it. He tried to escape. They shot him in the leg. He still limped. I think he still had a piece of the bullet in his body. He was rude, crude, and socially unacceptable, and a great guy. I mean, a great leader. And in fact, when Yogi and I were going through RTU at Luke, he was the assistant DO, and just a great guy. And he was and he was called Bull because he was a big hulking man. And so it just so happened he had a twin brother named Steve, who was in the Navy. And at the time, he was on the Teddy Roosevelt, and he was in charge of the planning cell. And so one day, I came into the squadron, and Bull had just finished talking to his brother on the SATCOM. And that morning, they had sent a couple of F-14s out, and that they did the recce they had the recce pods on the F-14s, and they had flown near to Lille, and they had found out that the Iraqis had moved the airplanes off the airfield and had parked them there was a circular road that went around the airfield, and they had parked them there. And then, and we probably didn't really know all this at the time, but they basically had put tarps over them. And so, but because of wind and whatever, some of them had been blown off, and you could see that there was indeed an airplane there. So initially, Bull looks at me and says, "Hey, Steve, what do you think?" I said, "Hey, there was a force ship that was had two LGB, had two jets that were a flight that had both of them had LGBs or had targeting pods, and then there was a two ship with CBU-87. And I said, why don't you go ahead and take those and we'll go out tonight and blow them up. And then we started thinking, maybe we need to call headquarters and let them know. So Bull called headquarters and he talked to Buster. And of course, initially the answer was not only no, but hell no, because it had not been invented at the TACC. The next night, though, the frag came. The next, that evening, the frag came down, and these targets were on there. So they go out there, matter of fact, Yogi, I went back into the Strike Eagle book because they talk a little bit. They talk about it. One of the concerns was that Talil was close to some of the ancient ruins and so forth that we weren't supposed to be destroying. So it was a big concern to make sure that they were going to deconflict any statues and things like that, the sacred ground, if you will. But anyway, they got there, and all of a sudden they're looking and they aren't seeing anything at first, and then all of a sudden they start seeing airplanes and or the silhouettes of airplanes, and then, like I said, some of it the canopies or the camouflage had blown off, and the first ones they saw were some MiG-21s, and they started blowing up these airplanes, one at a time, and they in the end they thought they had blown up about six or seven of them. Okay. But come to find out, when they came back home that night and took a look is that these airplanes were parked nose to tail. So if you hit one, you probably got two or three, and they got credited with 18, which was that was like $200 million worth of aircraft that were blown up that were just sitting out there, which was but I thought it was pretty amazing that the way that it was found for the mission planning was just two brothers happened to be talking to each other, and that's how we found it. I mean, and I know Yogi can tell you when on the previous interview, a similar type thing, just by using the targeting pod. That once we got the targeting pods and we're sitting out there in that SCUD box for 4 hours, you can look at, you can do a lot of looking, and that's when Yogi and Polo found the warehouse that they blew up, which was spectacular. When he put the bomb through the front door, and this was a humongous warehouse, and you could see the lights as it would as it came through the windows, and it went down went down. But even the funnier part was because Yogi and Polo Yogi was so enamored with it that they started shooting at him, and Polo said, "Hey, we got to do something. Let's get out of here."
The thing blew up, and I looked down. We're like 8,000 feet over the middle of H2 airfield, and 130 guns started shooting at us. Oh my gosh, how did we get here?
The next one is I have to go back. I was saying earlier, one thing you do a lot of learning in a fighter squadron around the barn. And, we were pretty fortunate. We had the DO prior to Everly was Dick Andrade, and he's if you go look him up or Google him, he's a legend. It just so, and a great guy. And of course he had flown a whole bunch of missions in Vietnam, had a lot of combat time. He was also, an air-to-air instructor at the weapons school, and just an exceptional person. And, so we were talking about, bullshit missions. And so it just so happened one night, I had come back from, I had a force ship in the mid part of the country. So I came back in, and about the same time Yogi's and his force ship had come back in, and we come into the squadron, and I go in and I see Colonel Hornberg, and he's smoking, and he had given up smoking. So I knew that something was going on. So, we find out that supposedly someone has found out exactly where in Basra on what train car Saddam is. And so the deal was we're going to go take him out. Well, and the other part, just to sort of set the stage, prior to us walking into the building, we had John Krogan, and he had a force ship, and they were on a tanker, and they were holding them in reserve. They were going to have them go into Basra. And at the time, Basra, and actually throughout the whole time we were in the war, Basra was a hot spot. And they had, there was lots of SA-3s, lots of missiles, lots of artillery, and so forth. And so it was someplace you really had to do a little bit of planning, or, be prepared to go in there. And so when they told me what they were going to do, they were just going to have John, meet up with some weasels, and nobody was going to be no coordination or anything. I said, no, we're not going to do that. And was Two Dogs was in, who was Two Dogs flying with us?
No, it was Clute and Reel and you and Bones and me and Polo and Sandwick and K9.
But I think
he ended up going.
Yeah, exactly. So
Two Dogs might have been in the original force ship.
Yeah, I think Two Dogs was there, and so I had Two Dogs call the weasels, and at least let them know, hey, what we're looking at, and try to come up with. So we're just basically coming up with a plan, because they wanted us to go do this ASAP. And but I just tell you, the whole thing sounded wacky to me. Okay, so I remember at the end, after we had planned, they kicked everybody out. It was me and the boss, and he said, Steve, don't screw this up. And I said, I'm not going to screw it. I haven't screwed anything else up yet, and we're going to go do this. And but I still was like sort of skeptical. And what we did was we took my two ship out of that four ship, and we mated it with Yogi's two ship, and so four of us went out. So no sooner had we gotten to the jets than I get a call from my ops officer, Bob Groover, and he says, "Oh, by the way, the plan has changed a little bit, or the coordinates of where Saddam is changed, and he's now somewhere in a triangulation of three points." And I'm thinking, so my answer was, so he's a hobo, and that got some laughs. And, but we had pretty much, amongst the four ship, we had pretty much talked, this was going to be high threat. So we're going to go in. We've got the weasels that are going to help us. I will tell you that of all the flights that I flew throughout the war, this was the one that I figured somebody was going to get nailed on. And so we took off, and as soon as we got airborne, Nikki Sandwick called up and said, "Hey, I've got an issue with my jamming pod and so forth." And so I just said, "Go home." Help our survivability numbers here. And so we're smoking. I mean, I don't know if we were supersonic, Yogi, but we were going pretty fast when
we were doing mill power to try to save a little bit of gas, and you were in mill power, and the rest of us were just hanging on.
Yeah. And when we got to the border, we blew our tanks, which we never done. That was another thing that I'd never done. And well, most of us blew our tanks. Yogi didn't get on his. All his didn't come off.
I kept my center line. It wouldn't come off the airplane for some reason. So now they're in mill power with clean jets, and I'm in mill power with a center line bag, which is 14 more units of drag. And I'm just watching them walk away from me as we're heading up toward Basra.
So we got up there, we roll in, and one of the problems that we were carrying CBU-87, at least I was carrying CBU-87, and one of the problems we had with CBU-87 was sometimes it just didn't work when you loaded it all in for the system to do it. And so as I'm rolling in, I've got X's, which is not a good thing to see, which means that I'm probably not going to get this thing off unless I jettison it. So I ended up jettisoning these bombs. I have no clue today where they hit. I mean, they could have been miles away. We got shot at. We egressed, and now we're coming down the coast of Kuwait, and we got shot at by an SA-2. And so we got the chance we didn't whistle, which probably would have helped, but because what happens when that SA-2 gets shot at you, the engine burns out, and then it gets dark. I mean, so it's pretty, and the other thing is you're doing this weave. What this thing's always trying to pull lead. So to do that, it just dissipates its energy, and so finally it ends up going behind you, and but it was pretty. I will tell you, it was pretty spectacular. And I think it went between me and you.
It went right behind. It went right behind me. I'll fill you in on my part of this because I'm 30 miles behind you at this point. as we hit the coast, and I can't keep up with them, so I'm just letting them drive out there, and I know where we're going, what we're going to do, and so they go down the chute, come back up, and they're climbing back out, heading back down south. So by the time Polo and I get there, the world's on fire. And this is actually the first time that in Desert Storm that I'm not number one going down the chute. So normally the pleasure of being number one, not a whole lot of stuff gets shot at you until your bombs hit the ground. And by that time you're on your way out. So I roll in, and this one.
It's good to be the king.
There's missiles flying by the canopy, and as we're screaming down through 18,000 feet trying to find this rail yard and all this kind of stuff, there's bullets going by and 85 millimeter being shot at us and all this kind of stuff. And so we pickle these things off, and I look down, we're doing like 1.15 Mach, and you're not supposed to drop CBU supersonic, but it came off and it worked. So test point there. And again, we turn around and I put the nose up about 30 degrees nose high, trying to get back above all these guns and stuff. And so we're losing airspeed. And so we're just weaving back and forth and trying to climb. And I look down after a little bit, we're like 3 miles inside the Iranian border. That can't be good. So we make a right turn and we're heading back down toward the waterway and the Gulf. And Steve calls out this SA-2, and we both look over at Kuwait City about the same time and watch this thing being launched. And of course, one of the bad things is if it stays stationary in your canopy, that's bad news. It means it's pointed your direction. And so we watched this thing as the missiles burning, as the motor's burning, and going, it ain't going anywhere. But I look down, I'm going, we're 17 miles from Kuwait City. This should be on a beam shot. This should be outside of the range for an SA-2 to shoot at us.
Yeah.
So that's going through my mind, as well as watching this missile just climbing up on the same spot on my canopy. And so the motor burns out after a bit, and we're going, this is uncomfortable as anything I've ever been in my life. And so I do about a 7G descending left brake and put out some chaff, and about 4 seconds and 6 G's back with some more chaff. And this SA-2 blows up about 1,000 to 3,000 feet behind me. Just all this stuff goes blowing out. I mean, my 3 mirrors, this one thing about striking, we had 3 mirrors. All 3 mirrors is white with this stuff that's going out beside the airplane. And of course, Polo being Polo is like, some explicit words come out of his mouth. And so, I go, holy crap, I can't believe that thing was pointed at us. And so you guys are some 40 miles in front of me at this point, and I just stroke it into all 5 stages of burner and go, it's not coming out of burner until we get back to Saudi.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up getting within 10 or 15 miles of you guys as we're heading down into Al-Kharj, because we're doing 1.3 Mach or something all the way back into Saudi, going, I'm done with this night. If I back up just a little bit, when this all happened, we had done a Western Iraq 5.5-hour mission before this. I'm actually sitting on the hot pits. Polo and I think we're done for the night when Gruber calls and says, hey, Yogi, get off the pits, send Polo to maintenance. You come in here. There's a mission going on. And so I walk in probably shortly after Steve does, after I park the airplane and Polo goes to maintenance. And I come in, and what I see is Steve and Hornberg and a couple of the people sitting around a map trying to figure out where we're going, what's going on, whatever. And I can vaguely remember one of the first things I asked was, what time's he supposed to be there? And you gave me a time, and I looked at my watch and went, that's like 55 minutes. We got to step like in the next 3 minutes to get out of here on time to do this. And so that I hollered at Z-Man, who was trying to find us coordinates and all that kind of stuff, and said, just send us the coordinates over the radio once we get in the airplane. And that's how we ended up with coordinates in the clear over a radio because I told him, I said, I'm not worried about anything. Just send me the coordinates of the targets we're going to drop on. And that's how we got the triangle. He sent us 3 sets of coordinates going, it's somewhere in the middle of that, and the idea was to try to find this rail yard where all these railroad lines come together. And he was supposed to be on a train somewhere in the middle of all that. And we're dropping 12 canisters CB-87. If I can put it somewhere in the middle of that conglomeration of railroad tracks, we ought to be able to hit him. So yeah, that was an interesting night. I was plumb tuckered out by the time we landed after that second one.
For sure.
What was the BDA on that then? Was he there?
No,
he obviously lived.
We found out about 3 days later. Obviously, he was not there because someone found him in a hole in the ground. Months later or whatever.
Yeah, no, he wasn't.
That's like
there.
On the last one I told you about the Winnebago out in Western Iraq that Polo and I dropped LGBs and split this little Winnebago in half, and he was supposed to have been in that night. So we keep getting these spurious things. You'd be up there in AWACS, we go, hey, go, there's a Winnebago type thing up here, go find it. We want you to blow it up. Okay, we did, but it turned out to not be there. So
yeah, no, it was crazy. So Steve, any more questions about that?
No, you're in a flow. I'll let you carry on, and then I'll ask at the end.
So the next one I want to talk about is the Highway of Death, which was pretty interesting. Again, it was another situation where I had just come in, and I got a phone call from Buster Glosson, and he said, "Hey, Steve, the Iraqis are leaving out of Kuwait, and it was a 6-lane highway, and all 6 lanes were heading north." Okay, and the intel we had was that all the vehicles were packed with, ill-gotten gain, televisions, the whole 9 yards, pretty much everything they had stolen. We had had a couple of air guys had been up there earlier, but not with with some limited weapons, as well as there had been some Harriers and I think there was like A6s or something like that, but had no staying power and nothing to stop, this whole thing that was going. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted us to, what Buster asked, he says, I want 20 airplanes, and I want CBU-87. And I don't know if if they've talked to you about CBU-87, but that was the wonder weapon that came out. One of the, it's not sexy, but what it does is it basically takes all the goodness out of all the other 3 types of CPUs that we had, and it had I don't know if it was 217 canisters.
202 3.5 pound warheads at a shape charge in the front. If that didn't go off, is 30 grains scored, so blow up like a 3.5 pound grenade. If
Plus,
it didn't
the thing that I like the best about it had a zirconium fire starter. So the pattern that we were dropping would cover about 800 by, say, 300 feet. Okay, we would drop 12 of these babies. The other thing that made it so good was it had a radar fuse, which the other CBUs that they had did not have radar fuses, and they had timer fuses, and they were limited at best. But and we used to always call it, they would get the wake up call, because when you would drop these things, all of a sudden you start seeing the lights, when the fuse would go off and split the canister, and so you could see these 12 things. That was the wake up call. And then the next thing you'd see would be this like football elliptical shaped deal that would come out.
Each of these 202 bomblets spun when the canister opened, so it made all of them spread out, and that's how you'd get the 300 by 800 to 1,000 foot pattern.
The other thing too, the other CBUs, the canister was spinning, and when it would open, the way there's a weapon, when we were weaponeering it, we would try to do the spacing so that they would overlap, because there was a hole they would call it the hole in the donut. Okay, so what you try to do is try to basically put this circle, like that, so that it would cover it. But they had this canister. They had fixed that. They had fixed that problem. I mean, it was quite frankly, it was an awesome weapon. So anyway, they wanted us to take, because that's going to be a showstopper. Truly a showstopper. So what I did is I went over to the chiefs and talked to their duty officer, and I said, look, get us and talk to maintenance. And I said, we need 20 airplanes. Don't care where they come from. As soon as we can get, as soon as we get any of them loaded up, we're sending them north. So I was in the second two ship that went up that night, and we went up at probably 30,000 feet, and so I contacted AWACS and ABCCC. They handed us off to ABCCC, and the target that I was going to go against was an interchange, interstate interchange, and it was funny. It was just like being back at Dare County Range, though, because when we checked in with the ABCCC, they said that you're going to be the third flight going against this in this area, and so they gave us a frequency. We come on, and basically, like I was rocket flight, so I just said, rocket, we're coming in from the south, and somebody said, okay, we're coming in from the the west, and so we just basically just deconflicted on our own. And but I will tell you that when I interrogated the airplanes that were up there, I thought that the system had broken. I'd never seen that many hits in all my life. I mean, because there was that many, because it was just that much, many airplanes that were up there. Anyway, we dropped on this interchange and come home. And like I said, this was the second flight of the night for me, and we were beat and never thought anything of it. We never thought that it was a big deal. And come to find out, at the end of the war, when Buster Glosson came around, we would jokingly said he was going to bring a beer truck, but he didn't. He didn't show up with one. But anyway, when he came, he basically told us that was one of the most important missions that was done. And the amazing part was that we'd go to bed and not giving it any thought at all. So, but I had the opportunity to go back later. I went back about 8 or 9 months later as the DO at Dhahran, and we got to go and actually see it was 13 miles, and it's nothing but carnage. I mean, it was nothing but everything's just burnout hulks. It was pretty amazing, but it stopped. It brought everything to a screeching halt.
Did everybody that night go up as two ships?
Yes. Yeah.
So just as you got the airplanes loaded and ready, a two ship would take off and go?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't take part in that, but I flew Buster. I was in the back seat with Buster after the signing of the peace accords. I thank my buddy Steve for letting me be the IP to haul Buster around all the time. He tried to fly with him one time and walked in and goes, "I'm done. He's yours."
But don't take that, Buster. We were lucky. We were fortunate that we had, Buster was our guy, because he was a great guy. He supported us 110%. Well, the interesting part about this, though, Steve, is that so when the war was over with, we came back to Seymour, and about a month later, I live. My mom and dad live about 150 miles away in Virginia, in Portsmouth, Virginia, and so my wife and my kids and I, we'd gone up there to see them, and so my mother had kept the front page of the Virginian Pilot for every day that we were in the war. So I was sitting in the living room, sitting on the floor. We were all just chatting and everything, and I'm going through these papers, and I get to the day of this mission, and on the front page in color is the interchange that I bombed.
Oh wow!
Wow!
Crazy, absolutely crazy.
So it's funny. I flew with Buster up there. We went up and flew around the oil well fires that Saddam had caught all the oil wells on fire, and actually went to the tanker first. And I mean, talk about a guy who hadn't flown this airplane but 2 or 3 times, and probably hadn't flown a whole bunch in the last few years. He jumps on the booms. We're steady as a rock. I'm just sitting back there in the back going, I can't believe this is going this well. We come off and go down by the oil wells, hook up over Kuwait City at about 1,000 feet, and go up over where they signed the peace treaty. And then we're cruising up the Euphrates, and he's talking about wanting to go all the way to Baghdad and fly over Baghdad. And I'm going, I don't think that's a good idea. And we probably won't have the gas to do that, and yada, yada, yada. And there's a town out there on the river, maybe 50 miles in front of us. And I said, yeah, we can go to about there, but I don't want to fly over that town because they shot at me last night. And so I don't know whether they know we've signed an agreement or whatever. And Buster's cruising up there at 400 knots and, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet. And he gets about 20 miles from the town and said, hey, let's come right about 30 degrees. He just like he ignores me or doesn't hear me or whatever. So we get to about 15 miles, and I just grab the stick and pull about 4.5 Gs and fly around this town, get back over the Euphrates. Okay, you can have the airplane back. I said, what was that about? I said, well, that's the town I told you not to fly over 20 minutes ago, because I don't have any desire to get shot down the day after we've signed a peace agreement.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we went on up toward Baghdad, and I convinced him we needed to turn around and go back home and not fly over downtown Baghdad. Mm. And we get back to Alcars, and it's one of those days where the sand's blowing 50 miles an hour. You can't see a mile in front of you. And so I call up the target pod, and I'm actually giving him a PAR from the back seat. Of course, I don't have the time to try to tell him how to get a targeting pod video up where he can see it or anything. And so I'm just going, hey, come right, come left, start your descent. I'm just walking him through a PAR like a controller would. And he breaks out, and the runway is right on the nose, and we're probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the runway. And I think still to this day, I mean, he goes, how the hell did you do that? And I said, oh, it's magic.
Well, the last mission we want to talk about was a sad day for us. We had Dave Eberly and Griff got shot down on one of the missions, and we knew that they were alive. Okay, so the next night, I went out and flew the exact same mission that they had flown. Although everything worked. There was a couple of things that the Weasels were going to be late. There was lots of changes they could have done, but they anyway went ahead and pressed on.
But it was Al Qaim by the Syrian border.
Yeah,
just by the corner of Syria and Iraq.
So like I said, the next night we went out. Well, sort of getting back to the Yogi's comments about being three. So the guy my number 3, Jeff Lattis, was whining like a big dog about how hard it was to be number 3 because number lead never got shot out, and number 3 got shot out all the time, and so I said, okay, fine, I'll be number 3, you lead it. And so basically we were going through. It was going to be a sort of level. It was a level type deal. And just prior to dropping the bombs, I hear on guard, I hear Griff come up and talk, and start talking. And so we talked back to him. The good news, we knew he was alive. He and Dave were alive. And anyway, went ahead and ran the flight. And I remember it as being, we were bombing over an overcast, and I could see lights coming up. I could see lights below the undercast, and but I was just assuming that was probably leads and twos bombs going off. And anyway, we dropped air bombs and came back, and when we landed, I looked over at my wingman, Mike Cloutier, and Clute's got nothing on his airplane. I mean, everything is going, his tanks, the whole 9 yards. I'm going, what the heck's going on here? And anyway, we get on the ground, and Clute comes up to me and says, "You're the most luckiest son of a bitch I've ever seen in my whole life. They shot a missile, and it went behind you." And like I said, I didn't give it any thought. I just, like I said, assumed it was probably leads and twos bombs going off, but obviously Clute and them, they pulled, did a 7G break and jettisoned everything they had. But then immediately, so that was the funny part of the whole thing. so we go in and go to Intel and let them know, hey, we've heard Griff and so forth. I come back to the squadron and then get on the phone. You know, prior to leaving Oman, the folks that did that, you know, what I'm lost for the
JRCC.
The JRCC, the guys that do the rescue. They had come to they'd gone to basically every unit and told and they came to us and basically said, if you go down in Baghdad, we're going to get you out. Okay. And that was very comforting, because up to that point, all the intel that we had was that it was a 10-foot giant. I mean, we even had some guys that had flown, you know, the Saabs and so forth, and basically, you know, I mean, that were in the C model squadron that had come over, and basically, you know, the way they were going, we weren't going to survive. I mean, this is the last thing as a squadron commander when you're getting ready to go into combat, is you want to, you know, build the guys up. You don't want them to think that there's, you know, no possible way they're going to get out of it. But anyway, you know, I was confident that, particularly after we had had a chance to talk to them, that I would, you know, could get something going. And then the other part of it was I knew that we had one or two airplanes that were sitting on standby that we weren't going to use that night. And if nothing else, we could go out and fly out in that area and be somewhere in the location, so that we could, you know, triangulate exactly where those, you know, where they were, and provide better information. But basically, I was shut down on that as well. And so I got into a pretty heated debate with a general, and, you know, I mean, you've told us you're going to do this, and so the one thing I don't remember 2 or 3 days, because we pretty much stayed awake that whole time. At one point, a C model crew had heard from Griff, and I got a phone call and said, hey, we want you to authenticate this. So they were going to send this thing down to us. I mean, the point being is that Griff and I had been together in the rockets for shucks, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. We had flown together a lot. Also, once we started flying the F-15E, him and Mike DeQueer, Slammer DeQueer, they were pretty much crewed together all the time because they were in Stanival. You know, I took the thing over to Slammer. I said, Slammer, this is Griff. And he said, yeah, it is. It's Griff. I mean, in fact, Griff lived in my neighborhood, and they wouldn't take our word.
Yeah.
And then the next thing we know is that we see them on, you know, it comes on television that they've been captured. It was a very, very frustrating. So
yeah, I talked to him that same night that you did, and then I talked to him the night after that. I was out in Western Iraq both those nights, and talked to Griff both nights. And of course, they're trying to get somebody to come pick them up, and had the same feeling as you did. And, you know, when I walked back into the squadron tent and you're screaming at people on the phone, I went, there's nothing else I can do, you know. But it was really disappointing, because when we escorted General Glosson around before the war started to do the pre-war pep talk to all the units, he basically said the same thing that people had told you in all these briefings. You know, if you get shot down, we're going to have you picked up in 45 to 50 minutes. You know, so that was a great relief to all these guys who are getting ready to fire it up and launch north into Iraq, that if something bad happens, at least I know someone's coming up to try to get me.
Yeah.
You know, I videoed pave lows and all that kind of stuff going into Iraq on a few of those nights that we found them just out there in Western Iraq, touring around the southern part of Iraq, and going, why won't you guys go north? I mean, this is what you're supposed to get paid to do.
Yeah, that was crazy.
What was behind that then? What this is coming from, you know, Horner or Glosson, or, you know, who was saying no?
Well, I think the JRCC, the leadership had, you know, they had, you know, had control of that. I mean, obviously, they had to brief General Horner, because Horner knew we had a couple of airplanes. You know, I just don't know why, and perhaps there was a good reason. You know, I mean, but like I said, the what we were told, and I mean, it was just very frustrating. I mean, because these folks, when they had talked to us before before the war started, they, and like Yogi said, I mean, it made us feel, hey, this makes us feel good. If something happens, there's a high probability somebody's going to come get me and get me out of here. And of course, that wasn't the way it was, and that was just frustrating. That was very, very frustrating. And then the process, every time, I mean, they wouldn't take our word that, hey, we know who these guys are. I mean, it wasn't like somebody was spoofing us. And
well, that wasn't a high probability that Iraq would be able to spoof American voices on a radio.
Yeah,
they just weren't that sophisticated. And the weird part of that too is, I mean, 8 or 9 nights later, I worked with the SAS guys up there, just probably 75 miles south of where Griff and Eberly were at.
Yeah.
And going, okay, if you all won't get them, why don't you go talk to the Brits? They're already up there in that area. All they got to do is take one of their dune buggies and go for a ride and bring them back down to the southern part of the country. Yeah. It was just disappointing, after what we'd been told. And then to have, it seemed like no one wanted to step off to go try to get them, pick them up.
Yeah. So anyway.
Well, what did that do then to morale generally? It's interesting.
Oh, it's horrible. I'll just tell you that, and then particularly the way we found out about it was because it was on television. And all the guys were hanging out watching the television, obviously, wanting to, get something, hear some kind of good news. I mean, they were pissed.
Does it make you more cautious then in how you execute thereafter? I mean, I'm not suggesting you then are sort of running scared, but do you second, or do you really think carefully about what you're going to do? Because no,
I mean,
you don't really have time to do that. I mean, I had briefed Polo before the war ever started that if something happens to our airplane, we're staying in it as long as it'll fly. We're staying in it, and if I can get it turned south, every minute I can stay in that airplane is a full night or two that I don't have to escape and evade in the middle of the night. So if you think about it, if you can stay in that airplane for 5 or 6 minutes, you've saved yourself 10 nights of E&E, because you can't do more than 4 or 5 miles at night trying to not be seen, at a slow crawl or whatever. So it's just like we're staying with it till it comes apart, and so I didn't particularly change anything about the way I did business as far as that went. It just chapped my rear end for probably a week or two. And it just was unnecessary, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think we talked losses on the first interview, but I know there was some of our conversation that I didn't put out, because I think at the end of the conversation, you guys felt a bit uncomfortable about some of the things that had been discussed in regards to, that whole sort of series of events that led up to the shoot down, and then what happened when those guys were on the ground. And so we'll just leave it at that. But did you, when you were going through those first couple of weeks then, or the first week, and you had been told you had this 29% attrition rate that was expected, did the fact that didn't materialize, so you did lose a crew, you'd lost I think was it Poulet and Pete Hook in the lead up to the war, so you lost a crew, then you lost Eberly and Griffin. Did the fact that you weren't experiencing the 29% or the 30% attrition rate sort of mess with your minds a little bit? What is the impact of that it didn't come to pass?
We also lost Teak and Donnie on another flight up near Basra. But those, I mean, there's extenuating circumstances to what happened with both of those airplane losses. And I don't know that it's worth getting into a bunch of it. Our best guess, and this is from talking to Merritt Krause, who was right behind Teak and Donnie, his best guess when he went through weapons school and he and I sat down and talked about it for a few hours, was that their loft recovery to get back under TFR guidance they didn't do it. I mean, they never got the airplane back to where the TFR would keep them hitting the ground. And so his thought and his mind at the time was that they had flown the airplane into the ground. Now I think the fact bears that out in that when they found the airplane after the war was over, that parts and pieces were still strapped into the airplane. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know something different, Steve, but I don't think there was any effort to eject out of that airplane.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not aware of that. But I don't. That's never. That never. No one's ever said that.
Yeah, and then Scotty Scott himself, I think, talked about the idea that on that 12 ship where Grip and Everly got shot down, they left the tankers knowing that the weasels weren't there. Now, whether that made any difference at all, you can speculate that till the cows come home. It might not have made a two licks difference, but there's stuff going on there, and if you ever talk to Griff, which I did in the bar when we got back home, he was surprised that he was hanging in his parachute.
Yeah.
I mean, he told me that he looked in, there was no fire lights, and next thing he knows, he's in his parachute floating toward the ground. So I can't talk for people that aren't here to defend themselves. So I don't know what Everly saw to pull the handles and jump out of the airplane. I just don't know.
Yeah.
But
well, to go back to your question, Steve, obviously we were delighted that the attrition wasn't like that at all. The other part of it was that, and a big discussion just prior to the war starting was General McInerney, who had been, I guess he was a PACAF commander. I think he's the one that had come up with the medium altitude. He was the big leader in medium altitude attack. And like I said, the next night I went to Lille at, 30,000 feet, just about on autopilot. I mean, because we had air, the key thing was that we knew after the first night we had air superiority.
Yeah.
And then, so it didn't require us to have to go low. And not to say that it wasn't going to be, there weren't going to be some dangers. It was a heck of a lot different than going that first night. One last anecdote I just want to, the morning after that we flew that first night, I remember walking through the compound, and Moon Mullins had been in Yogi's, was it 4 or 6 airplanes that you had?
I had 6, but I split those 3 and 3 on 2 different targets.
Yeah. So basically, I can remember walking by Moon, and there was the 1,000-yard stare. Moon in his back seat, or
Richie Horan.
Richie Horan. They had come, when you look at their video, they had come very close to hitting the ground. And but the point being is that the point that I want to make is that as we were talking earlier, when we were back in peacetime doing ORIs and OREs, you knew after the first couple of days it was going to be over with, and then you were back to business as usual. But I think the reality set in after that first night that this was a marathon. This wasn't going to be a 3 or 4 day sprint. And and I think it can, that in itself plays with your mind. That you got to be careful, because you start thinking you're bulletproof, and you can't do that.
Yeah. Well, in that first night too, if you remember right, we had a couple of SCUD warnings, where the sirens all went off and we're all jumping out of bed. I mean, you've just gone through this whole high with adrenaline to the low after you land. You finally get to sleep, and then I think there were 2 alarms, SCUD alarm things that went off. We were all jumping out of bed, putting on gas masks, and going out and jumping in sandbag bunkers behind the tents, going, this is nuts. We can't keep doing this kind of stuff and plan on getting up tomorrow and flying again.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Can you take us back to the first night then? I'm really curious to understand the suggestion, and I don't know, Steve, if it was you or Yogi, but one of you said that if you'd been better with the working of the air-to-air radar, probably on that first night you'd have got 2 or 3 kills. Can you What were those opportunities, and why would why was a better radar knowledge required to achieve those?
Well, there's a MiG-29 and a MiG-23 that got into that 22 ship formation. And the guys were both cruising at about 4,000. One was at 4,000, one was about 4,300 feet. And like Dipper, an airplane in front of me or so, that guy was 20 to 30 degrees off the right side of his nose at 10 miles at 4,000 feet. And with an AIM-9M, that's check 20 degrees to the right, lift your nose up 10 degrees, get a tone and shoot. And that MiG-29 would have been dead. But because we hadn't trained, we spent very little time with AIM-9s on the airplane before we went over there. And a lot of that is it's not necessarily someone's fault. It's the fact that we got back I got back from Luke in January. We left in August. And when I got back in January, what did we have? 3 airplanes?
Yeah.
I mean, it was next to nothing. We're all standing around the scheduling board trying to figure out, is this the day I get to fly this week? Because the deliveries of airplanes, in fact, some of us spent just about as much time flying to St. Louis to pick up airplanes and flying back to Seymour as we did flying sorties at Seymour. And so there's some of that kind of stuff that took place. The MiG-23 was offset. He actually came from behind your flight, Steve, around from out there in Western Iraq. He came out and kind of chased you guys down for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that we would have had a great opportunity to shoot him, but there was another MiG-29 that was 30 or 40 miles off of you all's nose as you were going to H2 airfield.
Yeah.
I mean, it's further than your target, and not that we would have gone chasing somebody down, but had he turned toward us and come at us, if we'd had more experience with air-to-air stuff, had he turned and come toward that flight, then you all could have taken care of that and maybe not even messed with your delivery of the weapons.
Yeah.
But if you're not used to doing that, and your mind doesn't tell you immediately 10 right, 10 up, tone, pickle, you have to think about everything. And so what Dipper's doing is going, okay, there's a guy right there. I got to do this. Now, what does I need to do? I need to come. Okay, but if I come this way, I don't know who's beside me. And if I pull the nose up 10 degrees, am I going to run into one of my own guys? We're all out there, lights out, and 22 airplanes out there in the same piece of sky. And that's one of the reasons I didn't do anything that night, because I'm going, if I pull up into that 3,000 or 4,000 foot regime to go take this guy on, I might get shot at by the C models coming in.
Yeah.
Because we had told them we're all going to be below 500 feet. If there's somebody above 500 feet, that's not us. And so, there's all that kind of stuff that's going through your brain while you're racing out. I mean, we're doing close to 700 knots going out.
So it started out, we were doing 600 knots and wishing we could go faster. The one thing we didn't want to do was to stroke the burner. I mean, one, because there was a fuel conservation piece, but the bombs were going and we could run it in at a high power setting and still stay in formation at 600 knots. But we were smoking, and probably the scariest part of the whole night was when we did zoom to altitude at the border and turned the lights on, and all of a sudden there were airplanes everywhere. I mean, that was the scariest thing that I'd ever seen.
Yeah, Wasty was about 3,500 feet to my left side that I didn't know he was there. Somebody else was 6,000 feet off my right wing. My 2 and 3 are behind me. And of course, when that all happens,
we did know that everybody was alive coming off the attack. I checked it. I checked everybody in, and so we knew everybody had made it through at that point. And quite frankly, we were actually surprised because we were pretty darn close to the border. I mean, I sort of thought it was Miller time because we were pretty darn close to the border, and all of a sudden that's when the MiGs ran on us. So
we're within 50 or 60 miles of the border when G shot that one down.
Yeah.
And that started the whole process too. When I started checking guys in as we started flipping lights on, Wasty sitting next to me has got 3,800 pounds. And I'm thinking, you're either going to land at the book or we're going to jump out of this airplane if we can't immediately get on a tanker. Then you look up there and go, okay, where are my tankers?
And basically what at that point, it wasn't a function of the radar. I looked out on the horizon and I saw lights and I just said,
Yeah.
that's gotta be the tankers,
Yeah, that's exactly what I did.
And we headed that way, and then, as soon as your two ship had gas, you got out of there. I mean, and the
Right.
deal was not to take a whole bunch of gas, although some of the guys, took, more than their fair share. That was for darn sure.
Yeah, I called up there and somebody was on the boom and I asked him, how much gas you got? He goes, 18,000 pounds. Get off the boom and go home.
Yeah.
It's like, you're taking gas that I need to put in his airplane.
Because Nikki was really low.
Yeah. Yeah, I took two airplanes back up there with less than, they got on the boom with 1,800, 1,900 pounds.
Yeah.
If you remember right, the tolerance on the fuel gauge was 1,200.
Yeah.
I mean, so they could have been getting on the boom with 600 pounds of gas in the airplane. Just nuts.
Yeah.
You talked about the absence of a experienced cadre in terms of Vietnam vets, people who've flown combat, which is kind of surprising because I talked to the Weasel guys. They had a couple of guys who've flown combat. The 111 guys had some guys who've been El Dorado Canyon, so that's kind of cheating a little bit, I guess. But these other communities seem to have a small number of individuals who were there to provide some counsel, let's say. What do you think you would have got then if you had a bunch of Vietnam vets in the squadron? What would they have imparted that you didn't have?
I think it would have provided a bit of calm, that particularly you take a look at the Vietnam vets that flew, F4s, 105s. I mean, man, they got hammered. So they had an incredibly tough life. I just think, I think it would have helped. I think maybe it would have helped to ask some more questions. I still scratch my head, and I feel like I should have said something when we were trying to get as many airplanes across the target, and we were doing it with a 6-ship. I mean, the basic fighting force is a 2-ship, but the most you do is a 4-ship. And I mean, everything you've got for lost wingman and all those types of things, if you're in the weather, is that you've got standard procedures. But the 6-ship, I scratched my head on. And then the other part too was that, like I was telling you when I asked Colonel Hornberg, are we winning or losing? At that point we had been back to some of these targets 5 or 6 times. Mm-hmm. So what was another 2 airplanes? Why were we why were we doing it that way? You realize that, and particularly in a major conflict like that, I mean, these targets are going to hit a whole bunch of times. So if things aren't right, like General Horner had said, if they aren't right, then you knock it off and come back another day. So,
well, another piece of that too, we probably flew 70% or so of our 4 ships with the same 4 ship from the time we got to Thumrait until we got to the war.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I had Gran and his wingman as my number 3 for most of the time I was in Thumrait. They knew what I wanted them to do before I ever told them to do it.
Yeah.
Now you put 2 more guys in there, 2 more airplanes in there and go, they have no idea what I want. So it takes more time to brief. It takes more time to debrief. It takes more time to talk about, hey, if this happens again, here's what I want you to do, which had all been worked out up to the 4-ship level. And of course, for me and Samwick, just like you and Matt Reel, we could have flown half of our combat sorties with no brief at all.
Exactly.
Just go, exactly what I want you to do before I ever ask you to do it. So,
well, one thing, so we got back, we were, I can't tell you how proud I am of the men in the Rocketeers. I mean, it was a great bunch of guys. We're, still very close. And Matter of fact, we had a reunion back in the fall, and it was just so good to see, all the folks. Unfortunately, Dan Backey had passed away. That was a sad point, because he was, quite frankly, he was a hero. And him and Tim Bennett, what they did with the taking out the helicopters and everything was remarkable. But he was, as good as an aviator he was a better person. And, that was a sad piece of it. But, we got back home, and then obviously, Dave Eberly and Griff, were back alive. The first things that I ended up having to do was I ended up going to funerals for Teak and for Donnie, and providing the leadership there. And that was it was a sad time. Both great guys. And matter of fact, Donnie lived right behind me in the subdivision we lived in, and Teak, he lived around the corner. And when my daughter needed a physical for sports or something, I'd send her on her bicycle down there, and Teak would give it to her. They were that close. So just great people. And and we did a lot of things. We had a lot of people send us letters and so forth. A lot of great schoolers that sent us stuff. And so fortunately, we sent a lot of the guys on cross countries all over the country to go back and speak to these, to go to these schools and, the first, second graders and so forth, and talk to them and thank them. But I remember one night I was in the bar we were night flying, and Dipper came up to me and he said, what's your vision for the squadron? And I had a long thought, and I realized I didn't have a vision for this squadron. I had just been glad to get home. And the worst thing that you can have going on in a fighter squadron is having no vision. And that was another thing that I learned, and that as soon as the leadership loses vision, that's when you're going to start losing airplanes, and people are going to get hurt. So, but it was what a great group of people. And
some of the best times flying was that time frame.
Yeah. And really the other thing that helped too was that, General Hornberg, he had a very strong background in personnel, and he was able to, Yogi ends up going out to weapons school, within a few weeks. We had Daryl Roberson got selected for the Thunderbirds. Great assignments, really, they just took good care of us. So
I don't know if you ever knew, but I got joint credit for Desert Storm.
I did too.
Somehow Hornberg worked that out. He called me one day at weapons school and said, "Go to this place, fill out these paperwork, write this up, and send it to these people." Yeah. And so I got joint credit for the time I spent at RSF headquarters or whatever.
Well, one last thing I wanted to was when the war started, General Horner was adamant that, you get air medals you get by just the numbers. I think if you fly 10 sorties, you get an air medal. Okay.
Right.
But the one thing that they wanted to make sure was that they didn't downplay the Distinguished Flying Cross. And when you look back at how it was done in Vietnam, the front seater would get, there was some kind of an incident or something. The front seater would get the DFC, and the back seater would get an air medal, which I thought was very unfair.
Right.
And so when we were having meetings between myself and Steve Pingle and Colonel Hornberg, I can remember him coming in one day and say, "Okay, so who's going to get, a DFC?" And I said, "Well, if everybody's not going to get one, nobody's going to get it." And of course that pissed him off. But Steve went along with it as well. And so a few weeks later, General Horner goes out with the Army, and the Army's giving out medals like candy. And he comes back and he says, "Roll the presses." So what I did was we had a squadron meeting. It was one of the few squadron meetings we had during the whole war. And we put together the best writers. We had 3 or 4 guys that were really good at writing. And the guidance was that you and your backseater pick a mission, and write it up. It's going to be the same for both of you, and then you're going to give it to this team of writers, and then they're going to put their spin on it, and then we're going to turn them all in. At the end of the war, everybody got a DFC, and that's probably the one thing that I'm proud of, that we were able to do that, because that means a lot. It meant a lot to somebody, for promotions and so forth. And these guys deserved it.
I still wear one on my baseball cap when I walk around. So
that's cool.
Yeah. On my veterans hat.
Can I ask a question about lessons learned? I mean, it's an interesting one, and I'll hopefully not be too long-winded in the way I pose the question. But before we hit record, one of the things, Steve, that you had said was, I wonder whether or not active duty people listen to this, and whether or not the lessons learned that are being shared here are transferred forward, and they can carry those on. And listening to you talk, and you just referenced flying a 6-ship instead of a 4-ship, flying 6 ships into the target area during El Dorado Canyon was a bad thing. Those guys were pissed that they had to do that. They said it's a bad idea. And you've referenced the fact you flew the same mission profile, or the same mission, the same night, or the next night after Eberle and Griff went down. And you said you went back to the same targets 4 or 5 times. Well, what amount of lessons learned did you have to relearn? I mean, when you came back from Desert Storm and you're talking about saying, what is the vision for the squadron, or you're going to go to the weapons school and you're setting it up, what lessons had you learned that you had to learn for the first time? What lessons had you learned that you could have learned through absorption through other people, maybe the Vietnam veteran cadre, maybe other methods, a codified transfer of knowledge from one generation to another? That's a long-winded question. I mean, you can answer it however you want.
It's a good question. Like I said, on the 6-ship thing, I'm just pissed off at myself that I didn't say something. As it turned out, it really didn't affect us. I mean, I guess we were lucky, but particularly when if you were going into a high threat type scenario, I just think that I'm pissed at myself that I didn't say something, early on, or at least, because we probably could have made a change. Although there was a huge push to get, as to get as many aircraft across the target as quickly as they possibly could be. Mm-hmm. But I just think, having that in your hip pocket, or as they say, in your toolbox, I think it just helps, when you start seeing what's going on. And you can, you have the opportunity to be able to raise your hand and say, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. And up to that point, particularly, you don't spend that much time, in your OREs and ORIs, you're only going to these targets once, you have to almost have gone to war to see some of the things that we went through. This is a small thing, but I'll give you a good example. When I went back, I got promoted to colonel, and anyway, gave the squadron up in the fall after I got back from Desert Storm. And then back in the following spring, I ended up going back over as the DO in Iran. And what was interesting was that, you remember, we had to have some special cables for the LGBs, Yogi, that we well, yeah. So believe it or not, nobody realized that. I get back, and we got all these missions, and we're going to go drop LGBs, and I said, well, where are the cables? What cables? What are you talking about? So there's those types of things, unless you're actively involved in this, it can slip, it can slip away. So crazy.
Yeah, I think too, we tend to think that volume is good. So if 2 airplanes across the target is good, 6 is better, 12 is better, 24 is better. But I don't think that's true. And particularly with today's capability, which is light years ahead of where it was when we were both retired, I think you're better off to selectively choose your targets and understand that just because you blow a building up today doesn't mean someone's not going to move back into it in 2 days and start trying to use it again. So you may have to go back and hit a target in a couple more days or whatever. But I think the biggest thing that I got out of all that we put into practice at the weapons school was that whole thing I talked about changing the entire mindset on how we use that airplane tactically.
So I'm going to give you a story, Steve. And this didn't happen in Desert Storm, but it did happen afterwards. So, like I said, I went back and I was the DO in Dhahran, and basically we had the same aircraft, but we obviously had smaller numbers of them. And then the way that we did Desert Storm, this was Horner's push, was he wanted, if he didn't want, say, like if the Navy's in the Red Sea, they're going to attack targets on the west side of, or if the Navy was in the Gulf of Oman, they were going to do targets that were on the east side of Iraq. I mean, it was basically, when the frag came out, regardless, that you were going, okay, and everybody got to do that. And but the other thing too is we had a comm system. We had the comm suite that was all in place so that we were able to talk and to chat with one another and so forth. Well, anyway, we get back when I go back over, and Saddam was looking to reconstitute the EWGCI sites because he wanted so badly to take out a 117. So they had put together a plan. The leadership had put together a plan. This was the previous leadership had put together, and as often happens, you put together a plan, but it doesn't happen right away. It sort of goes in a can, and then they bring it out, dust it off, and change it. Well, so I show up, and the initial plan was very good. And it was going to be a counterclockwise flow. It was going to be Navy and Army. The Navy was off the carriers in the Gulf of Oman, and then we were out of Dhahran. And so it was going to be a counterclockwise flow. The problem was when the aircraft were egressing, they had put a whole bunch of SA-2s, SA-6s, SA-8s, the whole 9 yards underneath. So there was a significant threat. And so I raised my hand and I said, hey, we need to change this. And I went to the wing commander, and he agreed. And we went to 9th Air Force, and this was, Horner was long gone. It was another guy, another 3-star. And anyway, he said, no, we're not going to change it at all. Now, digressing, the day that I was sent over, that I was getting on the airplane to go over to Dhahran, I get a call from Buster Glosson, and Buster was in the Pentagon at that time. And he calls me and says, hey, they're not telling me what's going on. Well, the reality of it is they don't have to tell him. Okay. I mean, they don't, the combatant commander owns it and not the Pentagon. And he said, if you see something that you don't like, tell me, call me up and tell me. And I'm thinking, yeah, sure. I'll get them, like shoot myself in the head. And sure, I'll be glad to do that, sir. And saluted smartly and hung the phone up. Well, anyway, it's sure and heck, I go back to my office after we're told, hey, we're not going to do anything, because my concern was that, somebody's going to get killed running, midair or something, just trying to defeat these SAMs that were going to get shot on air egress. So I called him, and anyway, I've got it. So a little while later, just for the heck of it, I called up to Riyadh to find out, hey, what's going on? Have I got a new job? Are they sending, somebody to take me away or whatever? And they said, no, the general's in a brace right now talking to the chief of staff of the Air Force about changing the plan. And then 30 minutes later, I get a phone call. There's going to be a helicopter that's going to pick you up and take you to the Kitty Hawk. And up until that point, every time we changed anything in the plan, something, came up or we had to make a change, we had to either fly the flight leads off the Kitty Hawk or fly air flight leads, because the communication was so lousy. The way I would contact the Kitty Hawk, I would call on Audubon to Norfolk, and then they would have a SATCOM patch. And of course it wasn't secure. So anyway, what we did was we did it the old school way. We had targets that were on the east side. It was sort of targets sort of like this in this placement. The EWGCI flight was down here. I drew a line, and we basically said, okay, Navy, these are your targets. Air Force, these are your targets. Don't cross the line. And we went, and so came back. It was time for me to brief the 3-star, and I said, so he said, how are you going to do this? And I said, well, we're going to do it just like we did it in Desert Storm. We got air superiority. We're going to go in, we're going to assess the area, and then we're going to drop 1,000-2,000 bomb at a time on the same point until we just, drive it all the way through the, the EWGCI site. Well, he went batshit because he said, well, that's how we lost airplanes in Vietnam. And you can't do that. Well, thank you, sir. We won't do that, but we did do that. And so Mike Stansberry and took his 4-ship out and destroyed the place, but that way. But again, here's, because we hadn't had a conflict in a long time, we had the thinking of the Vietnam thinking compared to what we had just done in Desert Storm. And, hopefully we do a better job of passing that info. And as well, we've had a heck of a lot more conflicts than, over the times ever since that. In fact, the air life changed afterwards because we went from, up to that point, up to going to Desert Storm, we were home almost all the time. The only time we would go, we do maybe 1 or 2 deployments to Red Flag, 2-week deployments to Red Flag, or maybe somewhere, but you weren't going more than several weeks out of a year. You were home. It was a great life. And then everything went to heck in a handbasket because you were on the road all the time. So interesting times.
Tell me a little bit about that then. We started by talking about Red Flag, and you've just mentioned it again. Coming back from combat then in, sort of summer of, or sort of early summer of 1991, did you come back thinking that Red Flag had prepared you well? Did you want to see changes in Red Flag? What was the thought process in regards to how well prepared you were, notwithstanding the fact you were flying the F-15E as a sort of an F-4?
Well, I do think, and Yogi jump in here, but I do think that Red Flag is very valuable training, and particularly for the young guys and gals that are flying these airplanes nowadays. And they've changed the way they do things. Back in our day, we didn't have aggressors, and now they've, at least there was a period where they had aggressors. I don't know if they still have the aggressors out there.
They do.
And but I think that they're I think the frustration was that there was a period, particularly when you had the air-to-air jets, the F-15C models. It was I wish you're dead type of thing. So you knew you're never going to survive. That was a little frustrating, but still the range is huge, and it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think wholesale changes were made in that 85 time frame. From your 77, when it was kind of gunslinger mentality, go do whatever you want to and try not to run into each other. 85-ish or so, they flipped that whole Red Flag thing upside down. In fact, some guys in the late 80s were calling it briefing flag, because you had to deconflict all your routes in and out, and all that kind of stuff. And that didn't mean you might not necessarily get off your route egressing out, but you had to deconflict everything going in and coming out, so that some colonel or general could sit there and go, okay, we have a pretty good idea that no one's going to run into each other. And so that changed. Plus that RFMDS system on the board, where they have complete control of every airplane out there, not control, but a reply from every airplane in the airspace. And it tied into some of that, wish you were dead thing. Yeah. Because even by the time when I was out there for weapons school for that 8 years, we'd go down there and use that thing, and you could program that system at that time to go, I want a 70% success rate off of an AMRAAM.
Yeah.
And so as your missile's flying out, you just get an X over something going, that one didn't work. And so, a C model guy turns around and he thinks he's killed somebody. He cruises back out 15 miles, spins back in thinking that guy's dead, and he's still chasing him.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of lot better experience out there. They had the little smoky Sams, they called them, that were styrofoam Sams that shoot at you while you're on the range. They'd only go up to 75 feet or something like that, but you'd get a white plume and all that kind of stuff and give you that real-time indication that something had been shot at you. And some of that stuff would even create RWR symbology in your airplane to let you know that, hey, something's looking at you and it just shot at you. So the whole mindset behind red flag in that 85, 87 time frame just changed dramatically. And I think it's outstanding training for someone to get out there and get their first 3 to 5 looks at what it might be like to be in combat.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole purpose of it nowadays, is to get you those first few shots. So, like for us, like you said, that I'm leading a 22 ship on the first night of my first ever combat mission, and just hoping everybody does what I ask them to do.
Yeah.
And the result of that was we had airplanes scattered all over the place. Now, you just have to say that thank God we were lucky that we didn't run airplanes into each other and all that kind of stuff. Even as well as was briefed, there was still the opportunity for guys to get crossways with each other, coming out in the dark at 500 and 600 knots. So, So, I think red flag is hugely valuable.
Okay, final question for me, because I'm running short on time, and you've been very patient with me anyway.
And your wine glass is getting low.
It is, yeah. It is. That's not on. So I'm hoping, Yogi, we'll be able to get back together and talk a little bit about weapon school and the development of the aeroplane over time. And you've both been sort of clear about the use of the aeroplane and the development of tactics kind of on the fly, and the immaturity of the aeroplane in terms of not understanding the airflow underneath it and bombs getting hung up and so on and so forth. But I wondered, did it feel to you like you were flying basically a fancy F4 while you were doing all this? I mean, you think about the technology. So you had a nav flare pod, so you had the TF capability for the low-level stuff you did, but you quickly transitioned to medium altitude, and then you were dropping some LGBs, I guess, at various points, but otherwise dumb delivery from medium altitudes. What did it feel like you were flying the Air Force's latest multi-role fighter?
I believe, yes and no. I've told people before, the F4 is like a Volkswagen, the Strike Eagle is like a Maserati. More space, more capability, more stuff you could do. In F4, I didn't have many options on what I could do in the front seat other than flying the airplane. I'm the consent guy that hits the pickle button to drop a bomb, but most of all that stuff was forced to be done from the back seat. And in that airplane, it made perfect sense for that to happen. In this airplane, it still makes perfect sense for an LGB or a triple LGB or a guided weapon of any sort to be controlled by the back seat. And that's the advantage of the airplane. He can be head down back there while I'm turning the airplane and getting away from the threats. But and I think Steve will back me up on this, you could be at 400 knots in an F4 and you light the blowers and go, okay, I need to wind my watch while we're speeding up to 500 knots.
Yeah.
And in an F-15, you do that same thing. You kind of get off the G for a little bit and light the blowers, and you're from 450 to 500 knots is 2.5 seconds.
Yeah.
So if you want to go somewhere in a hurry, this airplane would do it much better than an F4 would, in my opinion. Now you could get an F4 going 1.6 Mach. It would scream if you wanted it to, but it'd just take you a while to get there, and it'd burn a ton of gas to do it. And so this airplane was, in my opinion, even though you could burn a lot of gas real quick if you just lit all 5 stages of burner and let it go, it was much more efficient airplane than an F4. Much the
more.
Other part
too, the other part when people say, ask me, everyone that has never flown a fighter knows of the F4, and they think the F4, they love it because it's a mean look. It looks mean. It looks like, it's a combat airplane. But like I tell people, if you were to take a combat loaded F4, and let's say you had 3 bags on it, and then the best you're going to do is 6 bombs. When you take off, you can't go until the gas is burned out of the wing tanks. You can't go above 23,000 feet. On an F-15E, I could take 12 bombs and go to 35,000 feet. No problem at all, then all the other pluses that you add in there. And then you take a look at, where these guys are going nowadays. I mean, I wasn't aware until I started watching your podcast, that because when I went to Lakenheath, we were still flying it like an we were still like flying it in some ways. I had hoped, to be very honest with you, I'd hoped that, the F-111 guys were really good at TFR, night TFR, weather TFR, and they were obviously very good at LGBs. They did a great job in Desert Storm. I was hoping that we could translate that, and particularly the TFR piece, but we just sort of quit on it. And that was one of the things that, I felt like we lost that capability, although, we're hopeful that everything we're going to do going forward is going to be medium altitude. Using the E-scope and all those things. Sorry about that. That was sort of a lost capability that I thought we lost. And
in this 27 years of conflict we've been in, it's all been geared toward medium altitude stuff.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so exactly. So it didn't matter. But I can tell you, when we first got it, that was a big deal. We were going to learn how to do this, and but however, we most people like me took the easy way out, and I just put the dot in the box and went that way.
Right.
So anyway.
Okay, so one final question then, quickly then, because we're on the topic, and I love asking people about it. Medium altitude, low altitude, places like China. Do you think it's inevitable that in some kind of peer conflict involving a peer nation, that there will be a return to low altitude in terms of a tactic? Maybe not permanently, maybe low altitude initially until the IADS is sort of reduced or affected, and then a return to medium. But is low altitude something that should be practiced, and that is a skill that shouldn't be lost?
Well, I think it is, because it's like Steve said. It's such a perishable skill. I mean, if you train a generation and a half to never go below 1,000 feet, they're gonna run into mountaintops and trees and antennas and all kinds of stuff when they go down to 300 feet again.
Yeah.
So I think for that reason alone, you have to keep your guys current in that space. Now, it'd be hard for me to sit here not knowing what the real threat and the real capability is. Like I said, the Strike Eagle is nothing like it was when I retired. I mean, there's so much more in that airplane. If you look at the F-35 and F-22 and the potential for AI to be doing some of this stuff, it's beyond my ability to even comprehend what you might be able to do with those airplanes. So, stealth is going to be huge, I believe, forever. And can that be combined with a low altitude attack to some point in the initial phases of a conflict? I think it can be, but that's based off of 35-year-old knowledge.
Although Tom Cruise just did it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I could probably sit down with a group of F-35 and F-22 guys and have them go, "Oh, we'd never go low again," and I'd probably understand it by the time we finished. If they could clear me into the classified portion of the conversation, then I'd probably go, "Yeah, I agree with that. Maybe 100%."
Yeah.
But based on my knowledge and my thought processes, I could still see a low altitude package happening into certain unfavorable countries.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, someone messaged me recently saying that some of these episodes of the podcast are now an essential part of sort of the history of aerospace and aviation and military aviation. I think this episode definitely can be classed as such. So thank you both for joining me. Really was interesting to hear you recount the stories, and also thank you for taking the time ahead of the conversation to think about what you wanted to talk about. It's kind of it's nice for me sometimes just to sit back and listen, and not to have to think too closely about what it is that I want to hear or where I want the conversation to go, and that's certainly been the case today. So thank you both, appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
I'm
And
really,
I'll tell you what, like I said, I think what you're doing, and you should be proud. I hope you are proud of what you're doing, because, and like I said, I hope if I was a wing weapons officer somewhere, trust me, there'd be a big push to take a look at what you're doing, because that's the only way, quite frankly, these videos or podcasts are the only way that people are going to learn those lessons, and learn about that history, and maybe file it away, and it'll save their life someday. So thank you.
Yeah, this has been awesome. I've got a group of 15 or so. Actually, there's 30 of them, but about 15 show up on my back porch every Thursday night. College guys for a Bible study and just relationship building and that kind of stuff. And I told them about this, that we were going to do this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and half a dozen of them got on their phone and Googled 10% true right then, and we're watching part of that last video we did. And so, I mean, I think it's a cool thing, and they're interested just because of the relationship with me. But if you can get that age group to look at some of this stuff and go, hey, this is the cost of war. I mean, it's not free. Sometimes our politicians try to make this out like, oh, no big deal. We don't mind sending people over to go play around in Ukraine or Syria or whatever, but it's not free, and I thank God for guys like Steve who were able to lead, 60 or 70 men through that process at the time, with full trust from us to him that he knew what he was doing and would do the best he could to take care of us while we were trying to do our jobs. And so you get into that, and I hope that's still true in the Air Force today, is that each and every individual in the Air Force has a job to do. And part and parcel, the first thing you do is do your job, and don't complain about how hard it is. Just do your job.
Yeah.
And so, you need great leaders, and that Steve turned out to be one of those. And, you need that to lead those people, but those people have still got to take on the responsibility of doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Air Force of today is different from the Air Force that you were in, but you set the example, and maybe it's there for people just to follow.
We always think that it's different, that
yeah. We always think that
every experience we've ever had, it was better.
We always think that it was harder. It was much harder and whatever. But I think we've got some pretty good folks leading us.
Oh, I do too.
Doing it too. So, but again, thank you very much. And Yogi, as always, it's great to see you, pal.
Awesome, brother. Appreciate you.